is breaking news on 2 News at 10.
Welcome to 2 News at 10. Breaking tonight, new signs of a ceasefire that may already be unraveling. Israeli military officials tell the Associated Press they're still attacking Iran as Iranian missiles continue to hit Israel tonight.
In the last hour, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel backs this plan, but it doesn't cover the fighting against Israel's proxy Hezbollah. That's in Lebanon. It all comes as a 2-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran was announced today. The agreement coming just hours before President Trump's deadline and his warning that a whole civilization could die. Iran saying it will begin talks with the U.S. Friday in Islamabad, and the deal would reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which is still under Iranian control.
So as things unfold, there are still major questions about how fragile this ceasefire is and what it could mean for the region.
We're joined live tonight with Amos Guiora, an Israeli-American professor of law at the University of Utah. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with your reaction to this. There's obviously a lot of moving parts. There are many different countries that will have to keep this very careful balance of peace for the next 2 weeks. What's your first reaction?
I think the first reaction is, I don't know if the word is cautious optimism. I think probably more than anything, wait and see, because the first few hours have not been conflict-free. As you correctly noted, there's been missiles being fired into Israel, and as you quoted the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, it's unclear from the Israeli perspective, if from his perspective, the ceasefire between America, Israel, and Iran also includes Israel and Hezbollah. As I understood initially, the Americans thought that would include Israel, Hezbollah. That's, I think from the Israeli perspective, that's not exactly clear. And as someone who spent 15 years of his life negotiating implementation of the Oslo peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, one of the realities of these kinds of ceasefires is the inevitable rhetoric, sometimes bombastic. And then the obvious question is, how will side A react if side B is perceived as violating the ceasefire? The Iranians have promised to enable ships to move through the Straits of Hormuz, as I understand it, with the Iranian Navy serving as escorts. In parentheses, I remind all of us that President Trump said there was no more Iranian Navy. Evidently, that's not exactly accurate. I think here we are 2 or 3 hours after the ceasefire was signed or agreed upon. There are far more questions than answers, and we also need to remember the geopolitics of the region, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and then the external forces, the Turks and the Russians, how they perceive their role in this. And obviously somewhere along the way there's also Egypt and how President Sisi sees their role in all this. This is beyond complicated, and one of the things that someone who has written a book on geopolitics that always worries me is who's listening to whom and who are President Trump's advisors. And the question really will be, what happens when there is a perceived violation by any of the parties? And will that bring an end to this, or will there be some kind of an understanding that these things happen and we take a deep breath and we can move forward? I think in that sense, again, 3 hours after the agreement was announced, far more moving pieces than anything certain or set.
Professor, as an Israeli American, I just wanted to ask you this question. You lecture a lot about enabling and people being bystanders. Is that in play here with this anti-Semitism that we're seeing across the United States and across the world, actually?
The question. One of the things that worries me, I don't have hair, but I wear multiple hats. How's that? I assume that here in America that there's been this perception, sense, cell spin that Netanyahu lured, L-U-R-E-D, lured Trump into this war, and which has probably been less successful than Trump thought it would be. And I see that if it's blamed on Israel, blamed on Netanyahu, then that certainly gives pause in terms of a potential spike in anti-Semitism. I well understand criticism of Israel. There's no one more critical of Netanyahu than me. But your question about rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic, not only voices, but also anti-Semitic attacks is, present day a reality. How this will impact that is an excellent question, and probably depends on how the next few days or next few weeks play out in terms of the ceasefire. Absolutely worries me if this, at the end of the day, this does not go as planned. And let's say for the sake of our conversation that there's a perception that what President Trump promised was not delivered. And then if, again, in the context of spin, Netanyahu or Israel is blamed for this, I can well see a rise in anti-Semitism, whether on the right or on the left. You know, after October 7th, there was obviously a rise in anti-Israel college campuses and so on. My instinct tells me that if the deal falls through and the war effort is not perceived as successful, that will lead to anti-Israel, anti-Semitism on the right rather than on the left.
We will be continuing this conversation in the days and weeks ahead. Professor Amos Guiora, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Many prayers across the country and around the world for peace to continue. Thank you.
All right, Utah lawmakers also reacting tonight to the news of a ceasefire. Senator Mike Lee saying pray for peace and continued success in negotiations.
Congressman Burgess Owen saying in part that this is a positive step towards lasting peace. He says, quote, I'm grateful for a president that doesn't play games and has finally taken decisive steps to end that reign of terror. You can stay with 2 News for the very latest on the ceasefire. We'll have any updates overnight on 2 News this morning starting at 4:30 a.m.
New at 10, construction along the Jordan River Trail in Lehigh keeping a lot of people up at